Hello and welcome to the third of 6 presentations in the Nuancing National Security Lecture Series. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join as an IRC member on our website at irckc.org. Please take special note while you're there of next week's programs on transnational security issues, as well as the effectiveness of economic sanctions. And for tonight's program, a central mandate of any national government is national security, but the responsibility involves much more than traditional military defense capabilities. Today, while balancing military and diplomacy priorities, national governments assess and combat threats in cyberspace and outer space, water supplies and power grids, food production, and energy chains. In this 6-part virtual series, the International Relations Council is taking a deep dive into the national security arena, offering historical context and global perspective for core dimensions of national security, as well as exploring the risks, priorities, and tactics on the radar of US security policy. We hope you'll engage with us today as we explore diplomacy and national security. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share the other conversations in the Nuancing National Security Lecture Series as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. We're grateful to our sponsors who have made today's program and the Nuancing National Security Series possible. In particular, supporting series sponsors Buttonwood Financial Group, Garmin, Nicole Gresham-Perry, and Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White. We are also especially grateful to our dear friends and colleagues at the U.S. Institute of Peace for their help with this program. Thank you for finding value in these conversations. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. George Kukaz is a trilingual and bicultural lawyer and IRC organizational member Hush Blackwell, and he's originally from Syria. He focuses his practice on mergers and acquisitions, investment management, and general corporate governance matters. George has been published numerous times in law journals and has received prestigious awards for his writing. George, thanks so much for being with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you, Matthew. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for our guests and IRC members for attending tonight's installment in the IRC's Nuancing National Security Series. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Ms. Yacoubian, who will present insight into tonight's discussion on diplomacy's role in national security. Ms. Yacoubian's impressive credentials and professional work make her an expert and well-informed voice to offer historical context and global perspective for this core dimension of national security, and to explore the risks, priorities, and tactics on the radar of US security policy. US diplomacy is one component among 4 US national powers that also include military, informational, and economic powers. Recent history has substantially highlighted the role and importance of diplomacy to further the international interest of the United States. Today's discussion will cover the current state and future role of US diplomacy in this strategic context. Ms. Yacoubian's work centers on conflict analysis and prevention in the Middle East, with a specific focus on Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Recently, in 2019, she served as executive director of the Congressionally-appointed Syria Study Group. Ms. Yacoubian is currently a senior advisor to the Vice President of Middle East and Africa at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She previously served as the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Middle East Bureau at USAID. And prior to that, Ms. Yacoubian was a senior advisor at the Stimson Center, focusing on the Arab uprisings. Ms. Yacoubian is a frequent commentator on the Arab world and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She was a Fulbright scholar in Syria, where she studied Arabic at the University of Damascus, and holds a master's in public administration from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and a bachelor's from Duke University. We are honored to have her here tonight. Ms. Yacoubian, welcome to the IRC and to Kansas City, at least virtually. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, George, for your very warm welcome, and Matthew and the Kansas City International Relations Council. It's such a pleasure to join all of you this evening, even virtually, although I wish I could be with you in person. I want to actually start by commending the Kansas City International Relations Council for sponsoring this incredibly timely and very important series on nuancing national security. I think tonight in particular, as the somber 20th anniversary of 9/11 approaches, as we reflect on the end of US military intervention in Afghanistan, taking a look at diplomacy's role in national security, I think has particular and abiding resonance. Before diving into tonight's topic, let me say just a couple of words about the US Institute of Peace where I work. USIP was founded by Congress in 1984. We are a national, independent, nonpartisan institute devoted to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for US and global security. You can learn more about USIP by visiting our website at www.usip.org. So I want to start with my three key takeaways. I want to present upfront the three key ideas I hope you take with you this evening. The first is that 21st century threats to US national security are far more complex and dynamic than challenges that we've experienced in previous eras. The second is that given this complexity, diplomacy and development have a critical role to play in US national security. And the third is that as the US pivots away from a forever wars posture, we need to upgrade our diplomacy and development toolkits. We need to focus on creating more innovative tools and approaches in order to more effectively meet these complex challenges. So circling back to that first point, let me just sort of unpack a little bit further the notion of complex 21st century challenges. Today, we are faced with a wide array of challenges, from cyber attacks to pandemics to climate change, issues around food insecurity. Some of the issues I think this series is going to be addressing, agricultural security, biowarfare. All of these are examples of complex threats to our national security. It's also important to underscore that we've moved from a unipolar world that characterized the end of the Cold War, when the US emerged as the sole superpower, to a multipolar world in which there are a rising China, there's a revisionist Russia, there are many regional regimes and governments that pose threats to US national security interests. And of course, as we approach the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we're reminded of the threat posed by non-state actors, in this case, jihadist terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and its successors. So with that context, I want to unpack two foundational concepts that I think will help guide the discussion this evening with respect to what is diplomacy's role in national security. The first is, how do we define national security in the 21st century? And the second is, what is the role of what are called the 3Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development in addressing those challenges? So traditionally, national security has been defined as the ability of a state to provide for the protection and defense of its citizenry. Throughout the 20th century, protection and defense were really defined largely through a military and security lens. Today, though, as we are in the 21st century, this concept of national security has now evolved. It includes components like cybersecurity, public health security, infrastructure resilience, climate resilience. National security is now multifaceted. It can no longer be defended solely or even largely through military and security means. Instead, our national security demands an integrated approach that harnesses all of our instruments of power across the US government, with other governments, and with a variety of non-government and non-traditional stakeholders. And this is where that second concept, the notion of a 3D strategy, comes in. So a 3D approach is often described as being like a three-legged stool, where each element of US power should be accorded equal importance. Defense, the projection of our military power through armed forces, diplomacy, the established method of influencing the decisions and the behavior of foreign governments and peoples using dialogues, negotiations, other measures short of violence or war. And development. Development really refers to US foreign assistance and programming that brings knowledge and expertise and resources to communities and governments as they contend with issues related to extreme poverty, the advancement of human rights, the promotion of resilient democratic societies. So with a 3D approach, if you exclude one element of power or you short one or more elements of power, that's going to lead to a rickety, unstable stool that won't stand strong, that won't be effective in defending complex threats. So if we look at this concept of a 3D strategy, over the past, we can see that there have been real differences as to how resources are allocated to the 3Ds. And I think this is most evident in two key ways. One is we've seen over time disproportionately low foreign aid budgets. So foreign aid accounts for roughly 1% of the federal budget, 1%. Now, if we compare that to other countries, if we measure foreign aid as a percent of gross domestic product or GDP, US aid spending on foreign aid ranks among the lowest. We rank 22 out of 28 developed countries. This is according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. Other countries like Sweden, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, they all spend roughly 0.7% or more of GDP on foreign aid. The US, by contrast, spends 0.18% of its GDP on foreign aid. So that's one area. The second is we see disproportionately high defense spending. Defense spending in the US accounts for 10% of all federal spending. It's nearly half of discretionary spending. And again, if we compare with other countries, the US spends more on national defense than China, India, Russia, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, Italy, and Australia combined. So if we take a step back and understand those two sort of distortions, we can see that in the face of challenges that cannot be addressed solely through military means, these distortions have led to less effective approaches to US national security challenges. And we've seen growing concerns voiced most interestingly by our military leadership that we are not leveraging the 3Ds in defense of US national security effectively. As just one example, in a letter to Congress in 2017, more than 120 retired military leaders underscored their, quote, strong conviction that elevating and strengthening diplomacy and development alongside defense are critical to keeping America safe. The letter went on to recognize the complexity of crises in the 21st century, noting that these problems do not have military solutions. So with all of that in mind, I want to turn now to the Middle East, which is the part of the world that I most understand best. and try and unpack a little bit further how we should understand diplomacy in our national security with respect to the Middle East. And here I think it's really important to underscore that 9/11 was really a watershed moment for US policy in the Middle East. It had real important implications for the role of a diplomacy. And so I think it's important to look at the role of diplomacy pre-9/11 and post-9/11 when we're talking about the Middle East. So pre-9/11, there are many instances of diplomacy playing a key, I would argue, game-changing role in addressing conflict that was a threat to US national security interests. So I'll offer two examples. One is the Camp David Accords, which were brokered by President Carter in 1978 and paved the way for the momentous historic peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979. And that's an example of high-level US diplomacy successfully addressing a decades-long conflict. The peace treaty, of course, still stands to this day, more than 40 years later. Second example is more an instance of multilateral diplomacy, and this comes in the first Gulf War in 1990. This was under the presidency of George H.W. Bush, when Saddam Hussein, then the leader of Iraq, invaded Kuwait. And President Bush and Secretary of State Baker at that time put together a remarkable coalition of 35 nations that worked together to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in a war that lasted 5 weeks. It was considered as much a feat of US diplomatic prowess as a military campaign, and in many ways was emblematic of the Bush-Baker foreign policy that placed a real premium on the role of diplomacy and American leadership. Okay, so now let's pivot to post 9/11. In many ways, 9/11 really was an inflection point in terms of how we leverage the 3Ds of US power. The response to 9/11, of course, inaugurated the so-called forever wars era in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And these military interventions further amplified the imbalance between defense on the one hand and diplomacy and development on the other. This post 9/11 Middle East was really marked by a greater reliance on force and coercion. And during this period, diplomacy and development increasingly took a back seat to the military interventions. What we also saw was that diplomacy and development were not well integrated into the military plans in these countries. Even though large sums of money were devoted to development assistance, the aid was often implemented as part of a broader counterinsurgency campaign with the US military in the lead. In some cases, we had development assistance that was put as part of large-scale nation-building projects in countries that had little capacity. Here I'm thinking of Afghanistan, among others, little capacity to absorb that aid effectively, and indeed led to further entrenching corruption and creating unsustainable dependencies. I think most importantly, particularly as we think about 9/11, many of the drivers that were present in 2001, the drivers of extremism, were not adequately addressed. And we saw that evidenced by, in many ways, but one was the Arab uprisings in 2011, which while they were directed against governments in the region, they were very much a reflection of longstanding grievances and disaffection amongst Arab publics. And then we saw very dramatically the emergence of ISIS and the so-called caliphate, which at its height occupied a third of Iraq and Syria, with 10 million people living under its control. Now, with all of that, there is a really interesting example, small, of a success, and it can be found, believe it or not, in Syria. In Syria, the US pioneered a different approach as it sought to bring about the enduring defeat of ISIS. In Syria, the US approach focused on what was called a small footprint of no more than 2,000 US special operators at its height. Today, there are currently about 900 on the ground. And this model worked to catalyze local forces in order to liberate some 20,000 square miles of Syrian territory from ISIS. in the campaign to liberate this territory, the US lost 6 lives. The partner force on the ground lost about 19,000 lives. And the cost of this enterprise was in the billions, of course, quite expensive, but nowhere near the trillion plus or trillions of dollars we've seen in other these large-scale interventions. And so in many ways, this model, which is known as by, with, and through, really could offer an interesting, innovative approach to ending forever wars that lies somewhere between large-scale military occupations and complete withdrawal. Syria is also interesting in that it highlights the value of locally owned and driven enterprises. This operation on the ground was organic, nimble, very responsive to circumstances on the ground. We didn't see local actors overwhelmed with a large foreign presence or massive amounts of cash that would fuel corruption. It didn't aspire to large-scale nation building, as was the case in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most interesting, though, our work in Syria, US government's work in Syria, I think exemplifies the very best of what a 3D approach can look like, with defense, diplomacy, and development all working together toward a common goal, which was and remains consolidating, stabilizing territory liberated from ISIS. It has been considered by many one of the best examples of interagency cooperation between the State Department, the Pentagon, and USAID on the ground in this complex conflict zone. So I want to conclude with just a couple of thoughts. One is, because I think we're really at a moment, honestly, that's more for reflection and humility about what we are able to do. It's clear that the era of large-scale military interventions overseas is coming toward an end. And as we look forward and we start to think about, well, what comes next, the role of diplomacy in national security deserves much greater consideration. Clearly, military force is not the answer to many of these complex challenges. And instead, perhaps we should think hard about a paradigm shift that pivots away from this sort of post 9/11 posture that focused heavily on military interventions and instead move to a posture that preferences the roles of diplomacy and development. To do that, though, we've got a lot of work ahead of us. We need to develop new tools for diplomacy that are better suited to the complexities of 21st century challenges. Our diplomatic toolkit is still somewhat postured for 20th century challenges. We need to focus on innovative, creative approaches to diplomacy and peace building that leverage the best of US knowledge and expertise and understanding to address these complex security challenges in a less costly and more effective way. Let me stop there, and George, look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Muna. Thank you for this very detailed read on the state of diplomacy here in the United States over the past few decades. As Muna mentioned, now is a great time to open the floor to our audience. I would invite everyone to submit any questions they might have through the chat box, and I'll do my best to incorporate the questions we receive and try to address as many as we could, so long as the time allows us to do so. In the meantime, I have a couple of questions that came to mind based on your presentation, Muna. So you addressed that concept of the 3Ds of diplomacy, development, and defense. And I was wondering in practicality, or at least from a decision-making perspective, what considerations go into whether to prioritize the diplomacy, development, or defense in a given situation? For decision makers, whenever they're making a decision, how do they balance the three legs of the stool?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying the process is messy by its nature. And I think in many ways, trying to figure out what the correct mix is of those three elements of US power is among the more challenging, because it demands a very clear-eyed diagnosis of what the challenge is, of where the threats lie. and then an understanding of which of the elements of power can best be brought to bear in order to address them. So I'll just give an example. I'll maybe elaborate for just a second on the one that I laid out in Syria, where we were looking at, I was working at USAID at the time, and the issue was as land as territory is being liberated from ISIS, in order for people to be able to return home, in order to ensure against the reemergence of ISIS, it is essential that these areas be stabilized, that the lights and the electricity and the water are running, that schools are able to come back into play, that there's some form of local governance. These are all the kinds of challenges that are not military by nature. These are classic development challenges and diplomacy challenges. However, those things cannot happen in the absence of security, and that's where the military piece comes in, where our military can create, or together with its partners, provide security so that there is an enabling environment that allows these other very essential activities to take place. But I won't pretend to say there are easy answers to your question, George. There really aren't. And given the rapidly evolving situation on the ground, often in many of these countries, understanding and getting that mix right, it is far more challenging than it would seem on the face of it.
And so to that same point regarding the 3Ds, there's some skepticism about the power or the effectiveness of diplomacy without the presence of military power behind it. What's your take on this? Do you think that diplomacy should come first and we're able to achieve our goals through diplomacy, or as you mentioned, we do need the 3 legs to be able to efficiently move forward and achieve our goals and interests?
Well, I do think we need the 3 legs, and I do believe oftentimes diplomacy should be in the lead. However, military power, having diplomacy backed by credible military threat, is often also essential. Otherwise, otherwise the words appear empty. And so again, I think the trick is staking out that political diplomatic position, but also being able to back the goals that we seek through diplomatic means with a credible military threat in certain instances, not always, in the event that those challenges go unaddressed. So there's a role for both, and I think diplomacy, in the absence of any sort of military backing, it also will not be successful. You can't lose one leg of the stool.
I want to ask about the importance or relevance of a country or government's global reputation in its ability to display an effective diplomatic effort in the world. Good examples of reliable, trustworthy diplomatic partners, for example, in the world, there's like Switzerland is known to be a neutral place where countries go to and can rely on, but also 2 lesser known examples are the role that Qatar played between the Taliban and the US. No one really thinks of Qatar as a diplomatic go-in-between, but as we all know, Qatar played a very important role to keep the chain of communication going between the 2 sides. And also another example is Oman's role in keeping the dialogue going between Iran and the United States back about 8 years ago or so, when the nuclear dialogues was going on. So my question to you is, how effective can diplomacy be when a country or a government lacks a global reputation in a certain region? And a very good example would be the Middle East in this case. Over, let's say, the past century or so, the European powers as well as the United States have really been blamed for kind of all problems in the Middle East, mainly due to colonization. And so how effective can the US diplomacy be in the Middle East when it tends to lack the respect of the local population?
Well, you've touched on several key issues, and maybe I'll address a couple of them. One is the notion of what does it take? In some ways, diplomacy or having diplomatic chops can be a force multiplier for a small country like Qatar, for example, that you raised. In many ways, Qatar is, to use a colloquialism, punching above its weight. This small, emirate, the small country in the Gulf, very, very wealthy country, but nonetheless very small, is able to play a very important mediating role. As you noted, between the US and the Taliban. It hosted the talks between the US and the Taliban over the last year. We've also seen Qatar play a similar kind of role in Lebanon when the country was in a dire crisis in 2008 and 2009. And Qatar has managed to carve this role out for itself by virtue of maintaining lines of communication, contacts with many, many different disparate actors. And Oman as well plays a similar role with respect to Iran. And so it's interesting to see how having that kind of skilled diplomatic background and network can actually enhance the power of otherwise, rather small countries, by no means regional powers, or certainly not great powers. The other point you raised, though, has to do, I think, you talked about reputation, I think, and of course, there have been long-standing accusations leveled against the US and the West more broadly for having a double standard when it comes to the Middle East. And I think, here what's important is credibility and being able to speak in a way in which, if there are challenges or issues at home domestically, those are acknowledged. And one still is, a country is still able to have the reputation or maintain its reputation in order to project its position and its views diplomatically. The other, of course, is that countries often look to see, does the United States or any other country stand by what it says it will do? Does it adhere to its word? And therefore, is it able to maintain its credibility? Those are critical. I mean, reputation and credibility are key assets that are important in the practice of diplomacy.
Given that we're talking about the Middle East, and it seems like there's quite a bit of interest in learning more about your experience with Syria as well as the larger Middle East, can you tell us a bit more about the diplomatic efforts of the US in Syria, and did the US government have to interact and negotiate with the Kurds, with the Syrian government, or both sides? And then the flip side of this question, given that the Syrian experience has been a relatively more successful one, can you give us an example of a failure of diplomacy in the Middle East that happened somewhat recently?
Well, I think in many ways, unfortunately, Syria, for many, is a failure of diplomacy. It's a failure of the United Nations and all that the United Nations was created to do, to be able to uphold. And we've seen in Syria, in many ways, a brutal regime survive despite not only its brutality, but its repeated transgressions of international law, the use, for example, of chemical weapons by the Assad regime multiple times against civilians, its brutal tactics, its use of systematic torture, et cetera. So in many ways, unfortunately, I don't think we can raise Syria as an example of the success of diplomacy. I think in many ways, Syria points to another important point, which are the limits of diplomacy and the ways in which our traditional 20th century architecture, the UN Security Council, the UN's humanitarian architecture, have not been adequate to the task. We've not been able to see that the UN really mobilize in a way that brings peace and stability to Syria. We have not seen even the humanitarian architecture as it's designed be able to accommodate the large numbers of displacement. The Syrian conflict precipitated the largest displacement crisis since the end of World War II. And we have these enduring challenges of Syrian refugees, for example, who are displaced, who are living in other host communities, whether in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, with very little prospect of being able to return anytime soon. And that raises, bigger questions about how long these other countries can host these refugees. So I'm afraid Syria in some ways is what should get us to think even harder about what kinds of tools should we be developing in the 21st century. To what extent should there be reforms of the United Nations, for example, so that the UN and other of these multilateral bodies are better poised, more able to effectively respond to conflicts such as the one that we've seen in Syria.
So looking into the future and thinking about the US's prestige in the world, at least in terms of from a diplomatic perspective, how do you think the US withdrawal from Afghanistan would impact its standing internationally and really its credibility and reliability when the United States pulled hastily, unannounced, kind of very rushed, and we've all seen the images of Afghan civilians trying to flee the country by jumping onto the plane and then falling off. Once the plane took off, how do you think that will impact the US standing on the international scene?
Well, I think we're going to have to see over time. Without a doubt, George, you're right. Those early pictures in the initial days of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan were chaotic and very difficult to watch. It's clear that the Biden administration then redoubled its efforts with respect to evacuations. But you raise a very fair point about the many Afghan partners who are having difficulty leaving the country. It does raise a bigger question for others who who would partner with the U.S. in the future about the U.S.'s durability as an ally. That being said, I do think the idea of ending the forever wars, of pulling out of Afghanistan, while one might take issue with how it was done, this is something that's sort of been in active discussion really across three administrations, both Democrat and Republican, and is reflective of the will of the American people, who have expressed, that they're tired of these forever wars, and in fact that it seems as though a majority of Americans are in favor of it. But I think you raise a very important point, and I think only time will tell what will be the fallout ultimately of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and what can the U.S. do now in these coming weeks and months to shape things in a more favorable way for the U.S.
We have a couple of questions about the concept or the term of soft power. Just from your experience and your understanding, can we use the term soft power interchangeably with diplomacy, or does soft power really include additional powers that can be brought in to help and support diplomacy, such as economic help or development help to certain countries to kind of help them lure these countries into our side of the discussion table?
Well, I think soft power is, to my mind, a subset or a one among the many tools that are in the diplomatic toolkit. And soft power, the notion itself, is a longstanding one that refers to ways in which power is used to incentivize, rather than, it's sort of the opposite of coercive tactics, And the question is, what are the means? What are the tools of soft power in the 21st century? We certainly know we had things like the Voice of America and other sort of more classic elements of soft power in the 20th century. But now with technology, with the digital age upon us, with social media, how, and I'm asking the question because I don't have the answer. I think we really need to do a lot of thinking about how soft power can and should evolve in ways that project US influence using a variety of means, and whether it's social media. Another area that I'm quite interested in is the role of diasporas, communities that live in America whose roots harken from another country. I'm of Lebanese origin, so the Lebanese diaspora is an incredibly potent and powerful force. The Lebanese American community has already demonstrated playing a very important role in the crisis that Lebanon is currently contending with. So I think, over time, there are, I think, very important questions that I don't have the answers to about what does soft power 2.0 look like? What does soft power in the 21st century look like? What are the means that we have available? What are the platforms that we can use to influence behaviors, to influence decision-making, to influence perspectives on the US?
So over the past few years, and probably the past couple presidents who have been in power, there has been a voice pushing to withdraw the United States from international affairs and global affairs. There's an argument to say that why should the US care about what's going on internationally, especially that previously one argument among many is that we needed to make sure there's a secure flow of energy, but really nowadays the United States is self-reliable in terms of energy. And there's an argument saying that we don't need to be as involved internationally. In your opinion, if we do go that route and the US withdraws from world affairs, what impact would that have on the United States position, economy, and role in the world, as well as diplomatic efforts in the world?
My own personal view is that a US retreat from the world would have a very negative impact on our economy, on our standing in the world, on the many challenges that I laid out at the beginning of our discussion. I mean, if we've learned anything, when I'm sitting and talking to you here virtually, because we are in the midst of a global pandemic, I think we need to understand that the complexity of the challenges and the opportunities, we should underscore, there are also opportunities that we face in a globalized, very interconnected world. In my view, demands engagement not only in order to effectively counter threats, but also to exploit opportunities, to grow markets for US companies and US products, for the US to really play a leading role in bringing together collective action, bringing together alliances to address issues like climate change, and other things that we see happening every day here in the US, whether we engage in the world or not. These things are here within our borders. And so we need to, I think, in order to be effective in addressing them, we need to stay engaged in the world. The question is really how. I think that's the issue. It's not whether or not we should engage, but how should we engage? What are the kinds of what are the levers of power and influence that we should be relying on?
So somewhat related to my earlier question, I want to touch on the importance of multinational organizations in creating a space for diplomacy. There's an equal voice pushing against the importance and the value of those multinational organizations, whether it's the UN, the the World Health Organization. So what's your take on the role and the importance of these institutions, how effective they are, how relevant and important they are keeping in mind that the argument says they're costing our governments money, they're not that efficient, why should we keep them around?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think if we look back at the history of the founding of many of these multilateral institutions that you name, whether it's the United Nations or the World Bank or the World Health Organization or the International Monetary Fund, all of these came as part of a US-led efforts, diplomatic efforts at the end of World War II to create an international system that was useful and helpful and to forward US national security interests. So I think sometimes we seem to have lost sight of the history of these organizations that were really founded by US diplomatic and economic power. Now, are they effective today? Well, as I noted to you earlier in the example of Syria and the United Nations, no, I think these organizations also need to evolve, just as we do, to meet the challenges of the 21st century. We need to think more about who are the stakeholders in these various organizations, and should they be broader? But I think they hold the hope for the kinds of cooperation and collective action that are, in my mind anyway, critical to addressing the many challenges that we face as Americans, but as Americans who are part of a global community.
So I want to touch on your earlier point when you compared the amount of funds and money going into US diplomatic efforts here in the US compared, let's say, to Nordic countries or other European countries. So now that the United States is pulling, at least militarily, at least from Afghanistan, from the larger Middle East, and there aren't as many funds as much efforts going into the diplomatic efforts or even economic efforts to this region, how do you think that will impact the US ability to have a say in the region or to be able to provide helpful direction to the countries in that region?
So I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, so I want to be very careful about how I address that part of the question. I think it's fair to say that the jury is still out on whether and how the United States, in a leading role as part of the international community, can still engage in Afghanistan. We don't know. We're watching every day to see how the Taliban acts, who is in the government that the interim government that they're constituting. More importantly, what's their behavior on the ground like with respect to women and human rights. So I think the jury is still very much out. And I would note that the UN and other international agencies maintain their staffs on the ground in Afghanistan. The other point I would make is I don't think we should equate military withdrawal from Afghanistan or the Middle East, broadly speaking, and we still do maintain a presence there, but I wouldn't equate that with total US disengagement from the region. It goes back to that point I made before about how we engage. And what I would hope, and I hope I made this point, is that as we pivot away from a military-dominated forever wars posture, we pivot to a posture and a strategy in which diplomacy and development and peace building, that those elements of US power take much greater precedence. And it's incumbent on people like myself and my colleagues at USIP and others, it's incumbent on us to reflect with some humility on the last 20 years of US engagement in the Middle East, and to think creatively, and I hope with renewed sense of mission, about how we should be engaging going forward. I would submit that the answer is not to withdraw completely, but the answer is to develop these diplomatic development and peace building tools, which, by the way, are far less costly than the military hardware and military interventions that we've undertaken in the previous 2 decades, far less costly, and one hopes far more effective.
So to build on your answer, and really my question is more theoretical or not really focused on Afghanistan or the Middle East in this case, but what in your mind constitutes effective diplomacy? How do you assess, or what metrics would you use to gauge diplomatic success after the fact?
Well, it's a great question. And the answer is, it's hard to say that. I mean, on the one hand, you can easily say that one measure of the effectiveness or the success of diplomacy is whether treaties negotiated, let's say, to end conflicts. And as the example I gave, a very simple one of Israel and Egypt, with now a 40+ year peace. If those are maintained, then that, to my mind, is an example of success. What's tough about diplomacy is that often the success is the absence of something. You know, it's the absence of conflict. It's averting some kind of a catastrophe. And so the absence of something is, of course, much, much harder to measure. And I think much more broadly, you know, again, in the era of the last 2 decades, I think we got too caught up in metrics around, and this is a problem that goes back to even the days of the Vietnam War, where there are all kinds of statistics and metrics that are leveraged to create the impression of success. But the reality, of course, is far more complex. So sometimes military interventions can lend themselves to hard statistics, but those hard statistics can sometimes be quite misleading. We have a lot more to do in terms of data-driven interventions. This is something that USAID, where I worked in the late 2000 teens, has put a premium on data-driven interventions and putting in place cycles of learning and understanding and being very clear about what kinds of interventions are actually having the desired impact on the ground and what isn't, and when it isn't, going back to the drawing board and learning and trying something different.
We have a couple of questions about examples of successful diplomatic efforts. So I know you already gave the example of the Egyptian and Israeli negotiations that resulted in peace that has been in place for 30, 40 years so far. Can you give us another example, whether from the Middle East or elsewhere, where diplomacy has been successful, and kind of, if you can bring in the concept of 3Ds, how the use of diplomacy, development, and defense were helpful in achieving peace or achieving whatever goal the diplomatic effort was trying to achieve?
Well, I think in many ways, it's an elusive kind of success of finding places where these 3 elements work well together. I gave the example in Syria. I think more broadly, for me anyway, the issues have more to do with how we bring these different elements of power together. I mean, there's so many things that we have negotiated. You can look at the Paris climate agreements. You can look at working through the World Trade Organization, various trade agreements that we've undertaken. There are many examples of diplomacy being successful. My own view is, I think, honestly, on this 3D strategy, we've got a lot more to learn and a lot more to do in order to actually find and develop and bring about those kinds of concrete successes that we're all looking for.
Thank you. So one other question that comes to mind is, what tools exist in the diplomatic toolkit? And I think you already partially addressed this question, but I'd like to touch on it in more details. What, in your opinion, are the tools available to diplomats and politicians in the various countries to push for diplomacy and achieve a peaceful outcome?
Well, I think there are a broad array of tools that are available. There's everything from, in the diplomatic toolbox, from formal negotiations to back channel negotiations. There's track one, very formalized, where the key parties are working at the table together. Track two negotiations, where people are, perhaps those negotiating are one step removed from formal governments. There are all kinds of economic incentives and economic assistance. There's public engagements, the soft power we talked about, the use of media. And then there are also, of course, coercive measures like sanctions and other things. So, I mean, as wide and varied as the world is, I think there's a broad array of tools. But I do think going forward, there's much more work that needs to be done in order for us to update those tools and bring them more into the 21st century so that they can more effectively address these kinds of challenges.
And we are coming close to the end of our time. So the last question, at least for now, unless we get other questions, I would like to look forward into the future. So looking forward into the future, what do you see as gaps in the US diplomatic capacity or priorities? And how can our country, our government work on bridging the gap or solving these deficiencies?
Well, I think the gaps really, again, have to do with how we manage to deepen cooperation across the US government. How do we harness not only diplomacy and development and our defense, but also how do we bring in new stakeholders, non-traditional stakeholders? I talked about diasporas. How do we include diasporas more? As I said, the complexity of the kinds of challenges we face, whether it's cyber or climate or pandemics, have only underscored, I think, just how difficult these challenges are. And so the gaps that remain, I think, are really how quickly the challenges on the ground are evolving, and whether or not our diplomatic and development and peace-building toolkits in particular can evolve and keep pace with those and come up with new tools and new approaches and more innovative and creative ways of addressing these many challenges.
Right. Well, Muna, thank you very much for your time. And this was a very informative session. I personally learned a lot. I'm sure our audience learned a lot as well. I want to say thank you to our audience, our guests here. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for being here with us, as well as thank you to the IRC team, Matthew and Evan. Thank you for all what you do. Matthew, I'll turn it back to you if you want to close it out. And thank you, Muna.
Thank you.
George, thanks so much for your fine moderating this evening. It's an interesting, important, timely, irrelevant topic, and you really helped us to explore that. Mona, I can't thank you enough for bringing your expertise to this virtual table tonight and helping our audience in Kansas City and beyond understand the central role that diplomacy plays in national security. As we framed this series, we talked about planes in the air, boots on the ground being the primary idea that a lot of people have about security strategy. And I think you've really made a compelling case for why it needs to be considered in a broader context. And so thank you so much for your insight tonight.
Matthew, thank you, and George as well, and the IRC. I really appreciate and enjoyed this conversation. As I said at the outset, it's such an important topic, and I thank you and our audience for your interest.
Absolutely. And you can, of course, learn more about the USIP and the work that they do on their website. They do fabulous work around the world and also helping us here in the United States to understand what's going on around the world. So they're a valued partner of the IRC. And we do hope that you can join us for the remainder of the Nuancing National Security series, as well as some other interesting programs we have coming up. Check us out online at irckc.org. Thanks so much, everybody, and we'll see you very soon.